To begin with, the center is, as you know, it's very new and it's very small. We have just completed the second year now of its existence, and it's very small. There are 3 actual posts. The first is that of the director, which, as you know, it's held by Carl Filio. Then there are 2 posts of professors. There are 2 professorships, 2 chairs. One is the half chair that Andrew and I share, and the other is the full chair that is also shared by 2 other people, Joan Raphael Leff and Bob Hinshelwood. Apart from that, we have 4 other members of staff who are basically on contract, and they're doing sessional work, but they have no university appointment as such. They were not. They did not apply for a post there. They are just co-opted to teach various courses. We now have 9 registered PhD students, out of which 7 are Jungian, which means that they were generated and now are supervised by Andrew and myself. In addition, we have 8 other Jungian applicants who are busy working, preparing their application. So if all of them were to be accepted, we would have 7 and 8. We'll have 15 people. I was joking. We'll have 15 people, which is, I don't think we'll have all 8. So one of our work has been to not just supervise these ready-made people because they don't appear from nothing. They come to us and they work with them to help them prepare their thesis proposal. And that process has taken from 4 to 14 months to prepare, because it's quite a complicated business. So our involvement is with PhDs is connected with that. We now have 7 Jungian PhD students. In addition, we have been doing with Andrew consultation on academic and research matters to members of all the 4 Jungian groups, from helping them with papers which have nothing to do with Essex. All this has nothing to do with Essex. With their theses, which they may be doing at other universities, advising them on courses, talking about academic matters. We have been doing that throughout. That kind of consultation has more formal entity in the form of sabbaticals. We have 2 people now who are thinking of coming from abroad, one from Japan, another from the States, who are planning to come for their sabbatical at Essex in order to be closer to Andrew and me and work with me. And these people will not be connected directly with any course, either in terms of teaching or being taught. They will be working with us. In addition, we have been doing some teaching on the existing master's program, which is a master's program in psychoanalytic studies, and it has a Jungian section. And Andrew and I have been teaching on that course. Then we have been involved in organizing and running the research forum, in which students, I take it for granted that you know that our center is a postgraduate center. So all postgraduate students present their thesis, their research, and that is a research forum. Andrew and I have been organizing it and running it. And in addition, one of us, for all my sins, I've been doing that probably because of my experience in academic matters before. I'm the director of the graduate studies of the center, responsible for all graduate students. In addition, we have been involved in interdisciplinary work because our center is closely connected with other postgraduate departments and centers and institutes at the University of Essex, such as law, philosophy, history of art, literature, etc., running joint seminars and postgraduate seminars, not courses. And this is for postgraduate staff, students and staff. We have been involved in beginning to assist with the establishment of a Jung archive at the University of Essex. And in a sense, all of these are pointers for discussion later if you wanted us to discuss this further. I don't want to spend more time discussing that now, just wanted to mention that. And more specifically, I think our unique contribution, if we could call it so, is that we have introduced two ideas which have been taken up by the University of Essex as a whole. The first is the idea of distance learning, in other words, using some whole program that would require some type of contact with supervisors, as ongoing contact with supervisors, face-to-face 2 or 3 times a year, so that people who reside abroad may be able to do a PhD in Jungian studies. So we have proposed that from the center. First of all, in the center liked the idea. We formalized that as a formal proposal. We put it through the university, and the university now is interested in adopting that for the whole university. So I think that's an initiative that started from us and has gone through the whole university. The second initiative which is included in this package now of our proposals for establishing the Masters in Psychoanalysis in Jungian Studies, is the inclusion of a self-reflexive learning journal as part of an academic course. And both Andrew and I are familiar with that type of university course, and we shaped it to suit our needs, and we can talk more about that if you want it. Essentially, the student is involved in some self-reflexive exploration of how the course relates with his or her own development of learning, really. So it's not a confessional, but it's some kind of self-directed exploration. We can give more details later if you want it. Again, we introduced that as part of our package of proposals for the establishment of a specialist master's course in Jungian studies, and that idea now seems to be exciting for the university, and other departments and courses are interested in taking that idea further. Perhaps not necessarily in exactly the same format that we have proposed it, but just that idea. And finally, last but not least, as they say, it's the proposals that we have been working quite hard for some time to establish a specialist master's course in Jungian studies. The feeling and the general feeling, as well as the initial feedback we have received from our proposals, are all quite positive, and hopefully we feel that it will be approved at the autumn, and then we'll be able to begin working in establishing that. So what we would like really to develop, this is what we have been doing. Essentially, in general, what we would like to develop is more opportunities for exchange with analysts, mainly from the SAP, but from all the other societies in London and abroad. We would like, as we have said repeatedly in the IAP newsletter, and as we have written in your newsletter as well, we would like to make available that resource to everybody, but also for us to benefit from that. So we really would like that to be a center of genuine exchange. When we first went there, we thought that there would have been more possibilities and opportunities for that exchange. In other words, we really thought that many of you would come there to lecture, either on existing courses or on ad hoc lectures, but that possibility does not exist within the existing confines of the small center, which has been desperately trying to establish some courses. But we definitely see that as a possibility as things progress and as the center develops. I think that's all I want to say for the time being. And
right. Thank you. that was really a setting of the scene, the factual background, and what our practical and concrete plans are. In this box in front of the table here, there are 25 information packs about the centre. I don't know if there's going to be quite enough, but perhaps friends could share if there are more than 25 people in the room.
That's fine, actually, I've counted.
That's okay, that's okay.
Right. What I'm going to say in my 20 minutes is based on this paper. I haven't got 25 copies of this, so there'll have to be an unseemly scramble if people want it, called The Future of Jungian Studies, A Personal Agenda. Okay. Don't read it now, huh? I'm going to divide this into 4 mini sections. The first is on Jung in culture today. The second, psychoanalytic studies today. Thirdly, something about the problems with teaching analytical psychology in a university. And fourthly, the opportunities that exist for progress and also for areas of research. So first of all, Jung in culture today. I think this has to be addressed. I know the last meeting of the applied section, but one I think, had David Tacey talking about Jung and the New Age. And I want to reiterate his point, which is that although one's stomach and other parts of one's anatomy cringes at the way Jung has been taken up by the New Age, it is in fact extremely important that we don't get too snooty about this, because there is a huge cultural penetration that Jung and Jungian psychology has managed to achieve. And we can, to be quite blunt, trade off this, both as analysts and as Jungian-oriented academics. There is really a sense in which the popular penetration of Jungian psychology is on the point of exceeding that of psychoanalysis. And I wonder if the 4 Jungian societies in London and the centre at Essex can actually make use of it. I hope so. But at the same time, of course, there's a lot of negative press about Jung, and I'm not one of those who is sanguine about the concentration on his sex life or on the idea that he's the founder of a cult, and a rather nasty cult at that. I think this definitely does affect even well-established clinical professionals. You talk to anyone working in San Francisco or Los Angeles, and they have less patients than they used to because of this. And I do think this could happen here. So I think that the role of the academy, where Jungian studies would be operating in a whole different style, in turning public attention away from the more scandalous and nefarious aspects of Jung and his time, into the more serious and worthwhile aspects of his psychological ideas and Jungian analysis. The role of the academy, I think, could be quite significant. The second thing I wanted to talk about was psychoanalytic studies today, because I have a feeling that some of you may not be absolutely up to speed on what this is and what's happening in this extraordinary development at the end of the century. There are a number of courses in British universities now, about 13, that are actually academic courses in psychoanalytic studies. That is to say, although analysts come and teach on them, and maybe some of the faculty are analysts, the students are not, and there is simply no clinical element in the course except for the study of clinical theory, which is often done very well from a historical and a comparative point of view. Now, these courses have until quite recently been totally dominated by the followers of Jacques Lacan and the post-Lacanians, and they are linked up with literary criticism and film studies. And there's no doubt that from an analyst's point of view, they are a bit of a head trip. But they are also very serious from the academic angle. People really do serious research in psychoanalytic studies, which is quite difficult for a clinician. I still find it difficult to understand how one can do it, but they do it. Now, these courses have taken off, like, it's incredible. And I really think we may be witnessing something very similar to the rise of sociology in the 1870s and 1880s. It didn't exist hardly before. So I think that the academic study of psychoanalysis could become a very big business. There are also about another 15 courses which are psychotherapeutic studies or university-based courses in psychotherapy, which are broadly speaking similar to clinical trainings but have a greater accent on research and on comparative work. They tend to make quite a business out of comparing the different theories, perhaps even more than we do, say, in a clinical training, where, of course, comparison does take place. There's a huge tension between these clinical courses in psychotherapy and the academic courses in psychoanalytic studies, and inevitably some courses have emerged which are hybrids, where often over a 4-year period you can do academic and clinical work in the university. But the main thing I want to convey is that there is a burgeoning field here which is almost completely devoid of Jungian content. In some universities it is not almost completely devoid, it is completely devoid. Jung, if mentioned at all, is as a somewhat problematic, schismatic, not worthy of any serious attention. In other courses there is a little bit of study of Jung, but usually as a kind of tribal hate object. You know, we don't want to be like this. And I'll talk in a moment about some of the problems that might be lying behind this. This is really why I think the accent at Essex has shifted from us being a very small Jungian element in a quite generous environment to Jungians, but partly it's generous because we've been generous to them, namely we pay. The accent can shift, we think, from a small Jungian element to a big Jungian degree. Now, this wasn't necessarily in the original brief, but it's quite clear that this is what we have to do. And the knock-on effects of this into the field of psychoanalytic studies are already quite extensive and will be, I think, very significant indeed. So I think you have to think along with us with our strategy here. Our strategy is to get a Jungian base in the university, not there as a kind of poor relation, but running, we hope, a popular and highly popular in the sense of well attended and highly academic and respected course. Then the other universities where there's simply no Jungian element at all, I think will sit up and pay attention in a different way. That's the second section. The first was Jungian culture, the background of that, and the second was just to bring you up to speed on where we stand in relation to this new and larger field of psychoanalytic studies. The third thing I wanted to share with you, and this is the difficult part of the talk, and you know, I don't quite know how to say all this, is what are the problems with actually being a Jungian analyst, holding a chair in an extremely good English university? I mean, so good that the sociology department, which you didn't mention actually, but with which we have very extensive links indeed.
Well, we're part of.
Yeah, we're more or less part of it. And it got a star 5 in the research assessment exercise, one of only 2 in the country. And it's not revealing any enormous secrets to say that our stuff got put in there with their submission. So, and the feedback we've had is that we are star 5 people as well. Now this has changed an enormous amount because the sociologists had to read our papers. They never read it, simply never done it before. So this kind of little thing is, I think, enormously significant. But the real story is quite different. The problem is that the well-known canards on the one hand and worries about Jung on the other hand will not simply go away. I've done a lot of empirical stuff on this. Some of you may have read what I wrote about it, but it's possible a lot have not. I asked now about 300 university students, all of them postgraduates, all over the world, what do you free associate to the word Jung? Number 1 reply is Freud. Now that is a hell of a problem for us if what people actually associate to Jung is Freud. But number 2 is something along the lines of anti-Semitism or he was a Nazi. And number 3, he was a mystic. Archetypes come 4th or 5th. So that's the man that is at the core of our project, which we have to sell in British universities. He's a second rate because he's not Freud, anti-Semitic because he's a Nazi, mystic, not meant nicely. It's not an easy sell, I think you'll agree. One of the other problems is that Essex, in common with most British universities, is pretty much caught up in what the jargon calls the linguistic turn in philosophy or the deconstruction movement in European philosophy, which is to say that nearly all the academics in the human and social sciences there don't believe that any one element in any picture is more important than the others. So there are no foundations, no bases, No hierarchies of concepts or ideas or needs or anything. Everything is, I'm slightly exaggerating this and simplifying it, but everything is construed as, broadly speaking, equal. Well, where does that leave archetypes? It's very difficult. To many of these British academics, archetypal theory is a serious problem because it appears to be a claim for universal applicability and knowledge. It appears to be suggesting that something is more foundational than something else, and to these academics' eyes, it appears to be ahistorical. That is to say, ignoring how things actually change over historical time. So these are some of the problems. There's the image of Jung, and we all know about that rather well. I think the anti-Semitism, but I mean I would anyway because of my interest in the topic, but I think the anti-Semitism issue is the single most pressing problem. But in the background somewhere there is a real intellectual issue about the theory of archetypes, which is not a fashionable theory unless you do something with it. And this is now what I want to talk about. How do we cope with these problems? As far as the anti-Semitism is concerned, I think we have to critically discuss it and to some extent accept that, to many people's eyes, it's a true charge, and do as much research into Jung in the 1930s in a completely open-minded way as possible. As far as the accusation that archetypal theories are too universal and too essentialist and are making a kind of knowledge claim that people don't want on board anymore, I think you can, and we all know how to do it as analysts, reframe archetypal theory as a theory of affects. And if you do that, then the idea that there are these great building blocks on which everything else sits isn't quite the only way to think about archetypes. Another strategy, of course, is to say, the hell with this modern fantasy about deconstruction and everything being equal. We're going to say there is something foundational, and we'll argue it out with you. And that's another way to deal with it. So I don't think that our experience so far suggests that there are no ways ahead with these problems. I think you just have to think quite hard about how to deal with it. The fourth and final thing I want to talk about, on a more upbeat and positive note, are the areas and opportunities for research. And there are quite a lot of them, and I hope this doesn't degenerate too much into a list, but I'll do my best to sort of organise it so that it isn't too much of a list. These are some of the things that we're interested in, that our PhD students are interested in, and we hope our analytical colleagues are interested in. And if we can get some or all of these going, coupled with the Jungian masters, then I think we really will have, in effect, a Jungian centre. The first area of research is clinical research. I don't think we can do research into clinical outcome. We just don't have the resources, and probably we don't have the expertise required. Nevertheless, I think there is something we can do in the area of outcome, and that is we could start to look at the assumptions underpinning other, much more hard-edged empirical researchers into analysis and its results. They're the assumptions underpinning their work. For example, what is progress from the point of view of various psychotherapy researchers? What is a good or less good outcome? And I think we can apply a sort of image-based technique to looking at what it is they think they're doing. I don't think we can do it, but I think we can be quite almost analysts about this and sit back a little and think reflectively about what psychotherapy researchers are doing. Then there's clinical process research, which I think is very different from clinical outcome research. What works in therapy and analysis, and why does it work? What concepts do people use, if they use any, and why do they think they're using them? And is there really a pattern, for example, between analysts from the 4 London Jungian societies in terms of the concepts and techniques that people use in analysis? Then there's research into supervision and the whole supervisory process, which we think we could do. These are process research possibilities. One idea I personally am very interested in finding a way to research in an empirical way is what difference it makes if you explain extensively, in detail, at the beginning of an analytical therapy, what the likely process and progress of the therapy will be. Because on the whole, analysts, on the whole, I'm not saying it's an absolute thing, tend not to explain in advance what's going to happen for good reasons. Now, there's a lot of evidence from psychotherapy research generally that if you explain at the beginning, in as much detail as you can, what's going to happen, why it happens, why the work goes the way it does, even with anecdotes about other clients, this research exists, you get better, in quotes, results. And I'm interested in this, and that's the kind of thing I think our centre could look into. Then there's research into the assumptions underpinning clinical work. Now, Michael Faldin was very fond of talking about the locked filing cabinet. You know, the analyst puts his theories and concepts into the locked filing cabinet. This is a very controversial idea, because for many people, it's simply not possible to divorce what you do from what you think and feel and the ideas that you've generated. It would be interesting to test the validity of the locked filing cabinet metaphor. Who does it? Can it be done? What are the effects of doing it? And what are the effects of having your filing cabinet drawers wide open? These sorts of things I call research into assumptions underpinning clinical work. There's also some work to do, especially at Essex, where they're deeply in love with infant observation. There's certainly some work to do about the whole all the questions that have been raised about infant observation. I wonder where that could be done in British universities, about the role of the observer and what the goal of the whole enterprise is, given that it is now a staple in so many trainings, either an actual de facto demand, although not yet here, or something in which there's some pressure for people to do. Again, not yet here, but I think it would be interesting to look into that. Then there's research into the historical evolution of the basic concepts, how they go through changes. And the theory of archetypes is a good one. It delineates at least 6 quite discrete and separate stages in Jung's formations of his theory. And it is in that particular area, and also in the area of comparative work, that bridges to psychoanalysis can, and I think should and will, be built. One of the things I've found myself getting into since getting the chair is that I get invited to guest edit psychoanalytic journals. I've just done one, Psychoanalytic Review, which did a special issue on post-Jungian thought, and we had an international panel of writers from the SAP, Mara Siddeley, and I wrote for that. And then there's going to be a special issue of Psychoanalytic Dialogues, which I'm quite sure I wouldn't have been asked to be involved in if it weren't for the chair. And from the SAP, Barry Proner is going to be that. They wanted mostly Americans. And they're going to ask a set list of questions to eight or nine Jungian analysts. The same questions that they've asked to 8 or 9 Cohoutians, self-psychologists. So this is a sort of academic approach to the theories. And I think it's quite interesting that these Freudian journals are now doing it. The last 2 areas of research that I think we will be doing, and indeed already we are getting PhDs through in this, one is straight historical research. For example, Gottfried Heuer, who I think you supervised today, from ADJA, who is of course German-born and German-speaking, is doing a research, a thesis, a PhD, into the influence of the life and work of Otto Gross on C.G. Jung. Now, Gross was an amazing fellow, a sort of sexual libertine, a psychoanarchist, but for a time very well thought of by Freud and by Jung. And although Otto was Jung's patient, it's fairly clear that they did a lot of mutual analysis, and many of Jung's ideas come from Gross's madder pamphlets and communications. And Gottfried has got heavily into this, and he's found Gross's daughter is alive and all this sort of thing. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. And this is historical research. I mean, where else could he be supervised on this? Quite frankly, there's nowhere else in Britain where he could go to do that. And then finally, applied research. Somebody is working up a PhD at the moment on using Jungian ideas into studying the prevalence of anorexia and bulimia in the Greek Cypriot population. Or someone else is looking at how narrative and story and metaphor is used by therapists who claim not to use it. Very interesting. A chap from the IGA, got a very, I mean, he's in some ways He's very interesting, and yes, I know. He's extremely interesting guy because this is the kind of thing. This is really sexy stuff. He gets these people talking. Me tell patients stories, and before the interview has gone very far, they're telling him stories about the stories they tell their patients. And it's very interesting work indeed. But he's got to get that systematic, because if he wants to do academic level work, he can't just score points. He has to have a hypothesis and some conclusions. So those are examples of applied research. Just to summarize, there's clinical research into outcomes which we can't do. But we can do something in that area if we're imaginative. There's clinical process research. There's specific issues, my particular interest in what happens if you explain. Then there's research into assumptions underpinning clinical work. Where do we stand on locked filing cabinets? I think we should be told, you see. And then there's research into the evolution of basic concepts historically and comparative research. Then there's straight historical research, recovery of the past, which I think the Gottfried example is a very good one. And finally, there's applied research. I just gave you 2 examples, but there are numerous ones. Yes, I realised. Sorry, Mary. Mary Addenbrooks is doing research into how you can predict or not predict what the likely outcome after treatment for addiction by therapeutic means has taken place. What actually happens afterwards, and can you conclude from videos and audios of sessions with people who have been addicted what will happen when they are in recovery? Because the problem is, would it be fair to say, the problem is that actually quite a lot of people come out of the clinic looking as if they're setting fair for a good future, but in fact it falls to pieces. And we want to know why. What are the predictors for an apparently successful therapeutic outcome going wrong? Right, that's my lot.
You wish to speak again, Renos?
Yes, well, that's my turn to have my 20 minutes. One of the remarkable side benefits, I don't know, it has been for me actually working with Andrew, because I find how complementary we are. We're quite similar in some respects, very, very different in many other respects, but amazingly complementary for most of the time. And although we didn't rehearse this, I can see how complementary his presentation is to hopefully mine. Okay, I want to also talk from my perspective about the relationship between analytical psychology and university and academic work. And I'll base my short presentation on 3 principles, which for me are quite important. The first is that they're all very obvious, but let's see what we do with them if we put them together. Neither the university academic ethos nor analytical psychology are static, definitive, given, or monolithic entities. Both are complex entities, if you wish, with various streams and nuances, as well as both, of course, are evolving in time and acquire new priorities. I think that is usually forgotten when we're thinking about analytical psychology and university. The second principle is that the past relationship between the two, relationship or perhaps non-relationship, was based on rigid positions from both. And the third idea is that I believe that currently there is a new landscape in both the academic world, theoretically, and institutionally. For example, the connection with therapeutic institutes in doing courses, and in analytical psychology, theoretically and organizationally. So there is a new landscape in these two entities, and therefore there are new exciting possibilities exist now for a more fruitful relationship between the two, and I feel that it is our duty to explore them. And I think that the chair, as well as the supporting structure around it, are very conducive for this exciting exploration. Andrew is basing his talk on that paper. I'm basing my presentation on a paper which was just published in the JAP, which perhaps some of you have seen, which was called "Is Teaching Jung Within University Possible?" Until recently, Jungians did not favor connections with the academy. We're sitting here and we sort of say, what a pity that hasn't been there. But actually, Jungians, by and large, were not interested in that connection. What do we mean by Jungians? If we understand by Jungians the members of the IAP, then we're talking about practicing analysts. And practicing analysts, until very recently, were feeling that any academic tendency, any academic interference or any academic connection was a kind of a unidimensional exploration, ignoring all the other functions, and it was like the thinking types who were involved in academic work. And thank God that the majority of us are not thinking types, but we're intuitives. And how can you put intuition into university and academic work, etc.? And that argument ruled the day, or the century until now, really. They never felt like our Freudian cousins that there can be some fruitful exchange, although not utilitarian in terms of immediate feedback and immediate benefit, but allowing the university to explore our field in its own way, like engineers allow university to explore things without expecting direct benefits immediately, but they do believe and trust that in time this will bring some interesting exchange. That attitude did not exist within Jungian circles. The Jungians who had academic appointments like I did for a long time, basically you had to sort of shy away and pretend that you didn't have any academic connections. Now, this climate, as we know, is changing now. And I would also say that so far, on the main, the attempts that they were made by Jungians to connect with the academic have been unsuccessful and, dare I say, misguided. So although on one hand we didn't want that connection, somehow we wished we were recognized in the academy. And that kind of half-hearted connection created, I think, a lot of unnecessary misunderstandings and certainly not clear outcome. And a lot of bad feeling. In this paper, I give some examples, and it seems to me that there were two directions that our attempts have followed. The first one was try to become as scientific as what we thought that the academy wanted us to be. And because we were not in the field, so to speak, we are construing scientific objectivity within an outdated 19th century model of science. And you have, for example, like what C.A. Meyer was saying, I'm quoting from him, that he was extorting Jungian analysts to become more scientific by producing statistical proof of the validity of our work. Statistical proof. That if statistical proof is something that is scientific, well, let's enter that field and show them. Now, for me, I think that's a pity, because that is actually changing where the Jungian contribution has its strengths. Its strengths are not in statistical proofs. So that's why I thought that was misguided. The second direction was to attempt to force a wholesale acceptance of Jungian psychology onto the academic world by extolling the inherent virtues of Jungian thought. And for example, von Franz admonished the whole of psychology for not keeping pace with the findings of analytical psychology. They should know what we have been producing and they should just follow us and incorporate the Jungian principles. Both of these directions have failed to produce substantial results, obviously. the first ignores the uniqueness Jungian psychology offers, making regressively subservient to making itself regressively subservient to an outdated and limited model of science, whereas the second direction arrogantly expects an endorsement it hasn't earned by demonstrating in specific ways how Jungian thought could enrich academic studies. And a little bit sort of imagistically, I say that the first approach just steps over the threshold into the academy begging for acceptance, whereas the second approach remains proudly outside the academy and with the faith of a street preacher of an obscure religious sect expects the academy to open its doors in welcome. Neither amounts to any viable connection with academic discourse, and analytical psychology continues to hunger for a more appropriate connection. Now, next to that, I think that when we're talking about analytical psychology, again, we're not talking about a monolithic entity. Some of you who know a little bit my work, you know that I have been feeling very strongly that actually not only Jung himself, but within the Jungian legacy, within analytical psychology, we have basically two approaches to knowledge, two epistemologies. One is what I call a Socratic ignorant, an open epistemological stance, which essentially says, I do not know, let's find out, let's explore, let's enter into the transference, counter-transference interaction, and then things will be produced and they will show us the wisdom of the psyche, let's see what will show, and things like that. And the other is the Gnostic epistemology, and the Gnostic epistemology basically says, I know and you don't know. I'm an initiate and you're not. I have the knowledge and you don't. And it seems to me that analytical psychology, Jung himself and analytical psychology have been struggling between these two polarities. And both, I would argue, are included in the body of our work and in the methods we use. But because we are not perhaps fully aware of them, we become prey of this and the other without really knowing. The difficulty, of course, is that yes, Jung was both. Jung was saying, I know and you should do this and that, and telling people what they should do. Also, Jung was saying, you're asking me what this dream is about? Let me give you some quotations. And he would say, I do not know. Let me give you... here he says, of course we know that Jung was very much against the nothing but interpretations. You know, he had even a special term for that. And in a true spirit of Socratic ignorance, makes such statements as stereotyped interpretation of dream motifs, he was talking about dream motifs at that particular time, is to be avoided. Even if one has great experience in these matters, one is again and again obliged before each dream to admit to one's ignorance and renouncing all preconceived ideas to prepare for something entirely unexpected. And as Andrew has reminded us, of course, Michael Fordham talked quite a lot about that, about not knowing and so on. And also Jung says, dream interpretation is in the first place an experience which has immediate validity for only two persons. In other words, no preconceived ideas and recipes and so on. And this, of course, is not essentialist or ahistorical. It's very much a co-constructivist approach, which is very much the epistemological currency of modern academic world. And this is what I feel quite excited, because in a sense, modern academic world has gone back to what Jung was advocating when he was epistemologically open and Socratically ignorant, and not when he was Gnostic. And they're basically almost verbatim repeating what he has been talking about. Now, I'm not interested in saying we were there first, na or something, but I'm interested in the implications of that. What have we done with that? And we actually have some experience. We have a body of knowledge, clinical work, trainings that are based on those ideas. And I think that if people were to listen in that way, what analytical psychology can offer, it will be actually very interested. And this is what we have actually found at Essex. We have found people who, once they hear that type of Jung, not the mystic, not the Nazi, not the second to Freud or whatever, but in his unique way, a person who has been talking against reductionism at the beginning of his career, even against reductionism, about co-constructivism, and etc., about all these sort of things. Then they say, wait a minute, I never knew that Jung talked about those sort of things. I lecture in different parts of the world. I hear that people come and say, wait a minute, this is something new. This is a different Jung. Let's study it. And that is for me quite exciting, because if we now connect that Jung, the epistemologically open Jung, with the new academic realities, which, as Andrew started, began to identify in terms of not just postmodernist, etc., and destructive and deconstruction and all of that, but in terms of the co-constructive element, in terms of the self-reflexivity and all these sort of things, Jung has been offering interesting elements, if not even beginnings, of sound academic methodology. So I come slightly from a different angle, and instead of saying about specific projects, what I'm interested in is, and what I'm excited by, is the idea of us developing further unique Jungian methodologies within academic discourses that can interact with other academic disciplines and other academic methodologies, and on that ground we certainly can be on par, and we can have fruitful exchange for further development. To give you some examples, for example, the emphasis on qualitative research and other ideas about narrative and discourse analysis. All these things are things that Jung, again, I'm not interested in saying he was a pioneer. Certainly he spoke about that with coherence. Not faultlessly, but with coherence. And I think it would be important to look at that. For example, when Jung was, what is the actual meaning of the personal myth? It's a very interesting idea, because it's a combination of something collective, which is a myth. A myth is something that is a collective entity, it's a collective structure of meaning, what I call it. And personal. So it's a unique combination between a collective and an individual realm in the form of a story. Now, with the whole emphasis on narrative, isn't it short-sighted not to look at the wealth of Jungian experience on the ideas of personal myth? And when Jung is saying, my psychology is my story, and he says that. And when I talk about Jung in that way, I compare him with Freud. So come, let's talk about it. Freud, you are talking about Jung being secondary to Freud. We're not here to argue which is better, but let's be very clear. If you take, for example, Freud's autobiography, he wrote two, as you know, and both of them are accounts of a movement. Nothing autobiographical, it's accounts of a movement. Jung wrote his autobiography for all its faults and everything. It's a human testimony of a very painful soul. He is a personal narrative, and he's saying, this is my psychology. Shouldn't that have any impact, the way we construe our psychology and work with other colleagues in relation with the narrative? I'm saying a lot about narrative because right now I'm completing a book on narrative that we have done at the Tavistock Clinic. I think that there are very tangible possibilities for exchange and interaction in a fruitful way. If we were to look at the methodological aspects of Jung. So when we're talking about the relationship between Jung and the academy, for me the question is, which Jung with which academy? not Jung and academy as monolithic entities, but if we're talking about the agnostic Jung, no, thank you very much. The agnostic Jung will never enter academy, thank God. Some colleagues of ours, as you know, will always want to use that. That's fine. It adds spice to life. It tickles us a little bit, makes us feel a little bit omnipotent, and we need that occasionally and so on. But if we really feel that there is much more exciting things, then we leave that. But the Socratically ignorant, and by that Socrates was saying, I don't know what virtue is, let's find out together. And then in the interaction, in the exchange, in the dialogue, in the dialogical interaction, something emerges. So in the same way, I think that can happen within the academy. I want to finish with something that I wrote about, I think, 17 years ago in my first book, and which is, that's the end of the preface of this book, which says this: the final testing ground of the survival of Jungian thought may in the long run prove to be the philosophy of science, epistemology and methodology. Psychology itself appears at last to have caught up with developments in science in general by gradually abandoning the restrictive and outdated models of causal, positivistic and mechanistic approaches. We all know about that and we have been talking about that. But now the difference is that there are tangible methodologies within the academy that are based on that. They are no longer slogans and orientations. There are specific methodologies. Carrying on from what I wrote there, theorists find much value in Jung's dialectical and holistic direction. That's language of the 70s. The future of Jungian psychology, with all its implications, may ultimately depend on the ability of a science, or read here now, academy, reappraised in Jungian terms to build alternative, viable and meaningful models. The most we can do is to dream the myth onwards, quoting from Jung. And it seems that that myth or that dream is actually materializing now in the academic world. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for those presentations. I mean, you've both said an enormous amount, which I think in some way reflects the enormous amount that's been going on at Essex in the 21 months since you've taken up this post. And I mean, it is actually alarming to think that Jung may be so easily caricatured and narrowed down into the sort of three reflex responses that you were bringing up, Andrew. And you've both been talking about how important it is to get the imaginative, intuitive, open, stimulating Jung more into focus, and how important and urgent it is to do that. But I think the most important thing at the moment is to get a dialogue going in this group and in the society and in the Jungian groups in London. We've got, another 50 minutes, and I think we should open it up straight away. You weren't thinking of having a break, were you, or were you?
Yes.
Yeah, you were. There are some drinks.
Yes.
So,
How long?
do we get up to
Yeah,
do it?
how long a break are we going to have? I
Um,
wasn't aware of this.
10 minutes or so. It's a short break.
Let's have a short drink.
Still talk.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
just
10
start
minutes.
passing them round.
Right. We'll have a
Yes,
10-minute break then for drinks.
Sorry I gave at that, Andrew, but I saw that little red light wasn't on and I thought maybe you hadn't set it right, but you turned it around.
I turned it around to show you.
That was what my anxiety was.
I know, I picked it up. Very caring, actually. Thanks.
You must all be bursting with questions. We have 35 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
I can't understand how you can do so much on one day a week.
Yeah.
Who says we only do one day a week?
Yes, you must be doing full-time at Essex, but then you must be full-time elsewhere as well. So.
Well, it's not what I really wanted us to focus on, but there are practical issues like the distance. You can do most of the, I think, am I right in saying all the PhD people are either based in London or somewhere where coming to London is no worse for them than going to Colchester. Without that, I think we'd be in deep shit, frankly. So we're seeing
see them in London.
we're seeing them in London in our own time. Yes.
That's wonderful.
You raised that.
What? Sorry?
It's all right, we'll be editing your tape after.
The tape isn't going, is it?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes, but so just on this also. I mean, on the internet, on the email, I get emails from all over the world all the time. You know, can you give us examples of what we can do? And that's not done only on our Essex Day. Phone calls. When you travel to lecture, somebody wants to spend time with you, and you have to go for lunch with them to tell them. And you know, I mean, you're quite right.
You spent the whole of the day doing this, was
At least.
Mary.
I was just going to say that as a sort of client, if you like, I found that usually the work comes in bursts.
Yeah.
You have to prepare something and you set yourself a deadline. And then I found these two guys, they're really good because you can ring them up and they will give a lot of attention just at that minute when you need help. And then you go for ages and who knows what you do. So it works very well, really.
But this is up to you. But this is something we hadn't anticipated, you see, and this is because of the newness of the field. If we were sociology dons, we wouldn't have to do so much preparatory work. You made reference to it, and you've just made reference in a way, because the rules of that game are known. And a typical PhD student in sociology has done a bachelor's in sociology and a master's in sociology, and possibly at the same university.
Yeah.
So we never really thought about this. I don't think anyone did. That we're not only doing ordinary academic supervision, we're also creating a field within which we're doing it. And I don't think that anyone could have known that that's what it would be like. But it's been very, very hard, and I'm glad it's been all right. But sometimes one's felt very inadequate because we just don't know what a good thesis in the Jungian area looks like, really.
Well, in a sense, that's why it has taken some people 14 months to prepare a research proposal that Andrew and I feel comfortable in putting it forward. Because first we have to develop it, as you remember. And then we have to put it to our center for final approval. And then it has to go to the dean. Now, we are quite sensitive. We don't want... we know that Jung is a mystic, Jung is this and Jung is that. At the same time, we want to go there not in a defensive way to prove anything, but actually to sort of say, look, this is an interesting piece of work in its own merit, interesting methodology, and this is what it has been quite satisfying, really, for us, that the 7 that already have been approved have at least prepared first-class proposals, including yours, that the dean felt, gosh, that's an interesting angle to do PhD. So the PhDs within psychoanalytic studies is a novelty at the university. And on top of that, if we're fringe of the novelty, you can imagine... But I think the best policy, and I think somebody spoke to me when we spoke now here, is not to go in a defensive way. Not try to outdo anybody, but just say, this is what we're offering,
But I think
it's good enough, and that's...
We may be slightly overstating our uniqueness. I mean, Christopher Hawke is doing stuff at Kent and at Goldsmiths, and Joy Chavarin's been doing stuff in the art therapy world at Hertfordshire, University of Hertfordshire, where obviously Jungian ideas are used. So perhaps I think we've maybe overstated the unusualness of it. If there's one unusual thing, it's that we are literally cities that are set upon a hill because we're tagged as the Jungian professors, or as our colleagues told us, the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
And maybe you two haven't quite had that because you've been in more general... I mean, I'd like to hear feedback about this. You've been in more general settings, I don't know. You've been doing Jungian stuff in the art therapy world, and you've been doing Jungian stuff in a psychoanalytic studies.
Yes, well, it's true what you say about there being a feeling that Jung's time has come in the context of depth psychology in general, in that I find the Jungian take on things, as I teach it both clinically and as it relates to culture, is making far more sense to people than Freudian and object relations ideas, and they're in good competition now, which I don't think was true before. And people are wanting to think about Jung and reading Jung. The question I'd like to ask, though, is, we seem to be able to give a lot to other disciplines, and you seem to give a lot to Essex University. I wonder when we're going to get the kickback for the Jungians themselves. When are people going to start reading us and start quoting us and using Jungian ideas and saying, well, it can be explained in this way, and there's this thinking about it?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I think that we're on the way towards that, Christopher. I think so. But it takes time, and frankly speaking, I'm not impatient there. I think I'm interested in doing well what I'm doing, and if that will come, that will be interesting, and I have no doubt that it will come.
I think that's partly how the academic game works, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it's beginning to happen. I mean, I got a call a week ago from the head of the drama department. Someone's done a thesis with Jungian ideas in it. I don't know what it's on yet. Would you be prepared to be an examiner on it? So, of course, I'm not stupid. I say yes, because that's what we're there for. Now, I don't think those sorts of developments will go nowhere, but you just don't know when you do them what's going to happen. A lot of people working there on masculinity, for example, and they're very interested in Jungian ideas, and they're interested in all these dreadful Robert Bly type ideas. So that's very hard for me because I don't like it. At the same time, I'm there to dialogue with those people, and so I have to, I do it. So I think if you mean by that as a kickback, I think that's already beginning to happen. If you mean, is the SAP going to be as honoured within the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies as the British Psychoanalytical Society is, then you're going to have to wait a while. Because one of the unfortunate things that's happened, and I think you'll know this at Sheffield, and you'll know it at Goldsmiths, and lots of people here, you probably met it when you did your Masters at Hertfordshire, is that a lot of the professional politics of the profession, unfortunately, get traced off into the university.
And that's how creative it was of you to make it a job share, because in effect you are a little small department, and talking to each other must be supportive and stimulating and make you look like a unit.
Yes, we get called Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and also by Americans we get called the odd couple. Do you know that? Do you remember that?
Well, that's a compliment.
Yes.
Which one's Jack Lemmon?
We have been called many things.
Yeah. And the cracks about our sexuality and all this kind of stuff. You just have to live with this kind of thing.
I haven't heard about that.
He hasn't heard.
Where are you being,
But
boy?
of course the other one of the difficulties, it seems to me, must be, is that with post-Jungian developments, that all of them, there has been quite a broadening or narrowing or whatever, but more different direction in the individuation process and how it goes on throughout life, as distinct from the second half of life, which Jung was about, where there's been a real shift in the Jungian orientation, and how much that can come into your Jungian presentation
Oh, a lot. You see, but
in
here's...
the academic world, as it were, because it seems to me that sort of development matters, as in fact there's been a lot of post-Freudian development, which is much more recognised than our post-Jungian development, therefore.
So you put your finger on why there has to be a Jungian Masters. Because in the Psychoanalytic Studies course, there's room for straight Jung. But if they're going to do infancy and child development, then they're not interested in Fordham. Why on earth would they want to teach Fordham? It would be their position. He's simply not mentioned at all. Now, we have... This is the deal that the SAP cut for us. We have 10 lectures on Jung. Now, we obviously mention lots of post-Jungians, certainly because our belief is that you shouldn't separate Jungian and post-Jungian. It's better to teach it as a cohesive thing, and that seems to work quite well. Nevertheless, you can't do justice to, for example, Michael and the SAP. So in the new course, which we're proposing, it's dramatically different because there's the time and the space to deal with all the aspects of Jungian psychology. It has to be some Hillman because people are very interested in all that stuff in the university, and there's a lot of stuff on Fordham and the SAP development. But unless we get this, I'm speaking partly with one, you as the chair, unless we get this Jungian Masters established, we simply haven't got the time and space in somebody else's course, which we've had no hand in.
And also to people who have never heard of Jung before, they are not there primarily to do Jung, or some of them have become interested, but because, I suppose, of the way that they hear about Jung, but they're already prejudiced, so it's difficult. But within an actual, clearly designated Jungian course, the subtleties and developments and charting the transformations of different Jungian ideas, that's the subject matter of the course.
And that's where the analysts can come and teach, you see. Once we get, because at the moment there's simply no room. Because what you just
10
to give
Jungian lectures, that's all there is.
Yeah, but also you need to know that for obvious reasons, the part-time staff are all local people.
Yes.
So you've got local child psychotherapists, and Ken Wright, you've probably heard of, a very outstanding psychoanalyst. Thank goodness in some ways he's there, because he's really local and highly developed theoretically. But basically, that teaching goes to local people because on the pay rates, only local people could possibly want to do it.
But I wanted to say, you see, I thought a lot about what you said today, and I feel that historically there's something been about, and this is maybe a caricature, but it's as though Jung and Freud were like the parents who had this terrible divorce. And then we're all left like the children of these divorced parents, really bitter, really acrimonious divorce. And it would seem as though, this is a caricature, it's as though somewhere the Freudians have been the ones who put up this omnipotent defence and have said, we know we've got the way, we don't care crap about you, we're not going to listen to you. And the Jungians have been coming up from an underposition of always saying, why aren't we loved? Why won't the Freudians acknowledge our ideas? Why won't they put quotes in their papers? Now, I thought that the wonderful thing about today is to say, we've got to love ourselves. Not going to get into competition with Freudians. We've got to say, we've got something good to offer. We love what we've got to offer, and I thought there needed to therefore be a very important link in reality, which is to say that I want now to say to the society, we need to give you an additional amount of money, not to Essex, but you, because you are promoting something that's important for the whole Jungian community. Now, it will be perhaps a nominal amount per year to cover some of your costs, but I think that would tie in with this idea about we have to value ourselves and what you represent for us, because as you say, it's a hopeless task to do the no, we said it first, because then you're still battling rather than being enthusiastic and interested and joyful about what we have to offer.
The uniqueness of the Jungian contribution, for me, is the key thing.
Yeah.
The uniqueness of not trying to outdo them in this or that field that the Jungian contribution feels uncomfortably, but what is unique about us that at the same time actually fits so well with the current developments. That's where it is.
Yeah.
If we pursue our thinking and don't pay too much attention to psychoanalytic thinking, we arrive at realising that the Jungian ideas about human development are very profoundly different from the psychoanalytic.
Very.
But we, at the moment, don't really have anywhere, apart from it seems you two, to tackle the subject of our theoretical base.
So tied up with synthesising.
Yes.
We should give up synthesising.
Yeah, but you see, I think to build a bridge between what Renos said and what you just said, there are places and people who go in for the unique Jungian contribution, but they do it in this Gnostic superior way. You see, that's
doomed for failure before you begin.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
I think we shouldn't underestimate the effect that the post at Essex has had, because I now work 2 days a week in the Centre for Psychotherapeutic Studies at the University of Sheffield. Now, I most certainly wouldn't have been offered that post if it wasn't for the influence of Essex. I mean, it was mentioned at interview, spoken about quite plainly. How much would I be prepared to teach? What clinical contribution would I be prepared to make? What did I see as the unique clinical contribution? And for my sins, I got some extra essay marking because students had chosen to do the role of the father. And of course, it was heavily Jungian, thanks to Andrew. And so instead of being second marker for a set of essays, they said, you're the person who knows about Jung, you be first marker, which for those of you who work in academic areas, you know, this counts.
Sure.
So I think we are already having an amazing knock-on effect, and I think if people are open, there will be these kind of opportunities in the courses which are scattered across the country. Sheffield is a very big course. Joy has had tremendous influence, and her name is often mentioned in the department in the art therapy. There's an art therapy course, there's a professional training for psychotherapists, which is the one that I'm involved in. There are multiplicity of masters in psychoanalytic studies, but they now will all have lectures from me on Jung as a part of their foundation.
Yes, I think that's what is inspiring about this for me too, because although I'm not actually involved in an institution now, but when I was teaching at Hertfordshire and at Sheffield, there was a lot of interest in Jung, but it didn't have the weight that this is that you're talking about, and I think that is coming over from Andrew and Renos today. That somehow maybe having that background and that backing gives a sort of solidity to people who are interested in Jung in other institutions in a way that perhaps in the past it hasn't been.
I'm interested, we're in the medical faculty, we're just moving into what's called the School of Health and Related Research. I think we are grappling with different problems from an analytic point of view to those that you face in the sociology faculty. And I'm quite interested to know if people, what faculty do you come at?
It has been applied human sciences. We were together with youth work, a diploma in counselling, and the social worker training, interestingly, an MA applied psychoanalytic theory. Now we are part of PACE, professional and continuing education, which is
so you're
a lot
in education, we're in medicine, and you're in sociology.
No, actually we're not.
We're not.
No, it's the biggest backing department. We are in the School of Comparative Studies. So this is by far the best place.
That's an amazingly prestigious and key place at the university.
It's where everybody wants to be. But I think that there's something about the individuals that are coming forward for the PhDs that I want to bring in here, because it ties up with some of all that's been said, and about individuation as well, actually. I think it's very interesting that so many PhD proposals are coming from analysts or psychotherapists for whom their individuation takes the form of wanting to do sustained research. And it's quite clear that this presents the mainline academics with something they've never met before. They've all had the odd retired clergyman who's doing a PhD in some dogma or other. But this is new. Large numbers of people who are in full-time practice, well thought of in the profession, apparently want to be students. At a very high level, of course, as PhD. And I think it's fascinating, this development. And I think
I'm not surprised at that.
No, not surprised.
We do our academic work in some ways much too early. You know,
Yeah,
if you go
right,
to
yes,
university
absolutely.
at
Yeah.
18, 19,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
do this academic course at a time when really you can't make the most of it.
But it's critical, these
And it's so nice that it's coming back now with all the wealth of your clinical expertise
That's right.
and
Yes,
experience,
That's right.
and bringing it back, plowing it back into the academic.
And it's essential financially, because not a single person at Essex is getting any kind of state money at all. I mean, the university gets £1,000 per head for each student signed up for a master's degree, approximately, from the Higher Education Funding Council. Okay, and they pay for a PhD. They pay about 1,300. Is it 1,300 a year? 1,300 a year for probably for 6 years, broadly speaking. Now, Kent is the only place where they manage to get any kind of grants at all, and they get very few, I think, British Academy grants.
It was dwindling.
Yes,
last I heard. It's
virtually. I don't know what happens.
Bursaries, that's all.
Bursaries. So
University bursaries.
yeah. So we're talking about this is quite fascinating, sort of psychosocially. A whole field is growing, sort of outside the official financial structures of academia, and I don't quite know what one makes of this, except to say this is very odd, very interesting, and I think in a way it's appropriate for psychotherapy too. So I don't know, no real point is going to conclude this spiel. Just it's interesting.
Could I ask a question about the MA? That and I think Gillian Ballon shouldn't be forgotten at
Right.
Hertfordshire. That she was a pioneer in getting an MA for people like us going there. But she was in the end defeated, wasn't she? Decided to retire. And the MA was then moved to the Guild. The Guild has taken it over, and it's much more psychoanalytic. Yes, wondering what you were. Wondering what, when thinking of an MA, are you thinking in terms of it being linked up in some way with clinical work, or would it be purely academic?
It has to be purely academic for reasons which are boring, but very important you brought this up.
Well, I think it is important.
In all the original thinking, and I think it's so right, it was laid down that we were not to be involved in a clinical training. For several reasons. Firstly, because it muddles up the SAP with another training in a way that will be unhelpful. Secondly, because I think Hugh, Colleen, Jane, Jan and Sheila could see that it wasn't going to be, if there was a clinical degree there, this tape is a nuisance, you know. It might not be the kind of clinical degree that the SAP would be feeling comfortable with.
That's all right.
Yes, that's all right. I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
So basically, it will not be a clinical master's. Now, the weaknesses of that are obvious. The strengths, especially if we get this learning journal thing accepted, are amazing, because we're going to get therapists coming to do it. There's no question, and we're not going to stop them talking as therapists, are we? But we're not going to supervise their work as part of the course because it's not in our remit. But this learning journal...
So you make the links, presumably.
Yes, but we're not going to say, tell us your cases and we'll supervise. We're not going to validate their clinical expertise.
You don't have to be responsible for that.
No. But do you want me to say learning? You should say more about the learning journal.
Carry on.
I'd like to hear more about
Right.
learning journal.
Do you have the new?
No.
You didn't. I have the old one, which is.
It's no good, the old one.
It's not the yes. Essentially, that comes from Wendy Holloway. Everybody knows her?
Holloway,
Holloway, yes. And also from a systemic tradition of training, where people are invited, I think that would be the best word to say, invited to monitor their own process of learning. What is it that contributes a jump in their learning, for example? What key elements contributed to them changing their thinking? What helped them solidify things, etc.? What associations did they have to that material? So it's that type of self-monitoring and self-reflexive, not too much in terms of psychopathology or personal psychohistory, although, of course, elements, sort of mild personal elements, such as, I don't know, because my parents were divorced, I decided to write my thesis on this, for example, on abandoned children or something like that. And just for a person to acknowledge that as a matter of fact in front of other colleagues without going into too much detail may just have some kind of not cathartic therapeutic effect, but it sort of somehow frees the process of learning. So it's a very sensitive combination between personal material, essentially self-monitoring one's learning in the context of the wider field of knowledge. And if that is done in the context of a containing group with a sensitive facilitator, so to speak, it's another type of infant observation almost.
Yes.
It's a kind of a self-observation, how one grows. And with the feedback one gets from each other, that in a sense we are offering that as a possibility of not only introducing new Jungian subjects, but actually new ways of teaching at a university level, a kind of a semi-experiential way of teaching at a university level that we're a little bit, I mean, I can't say that, I think, we're a little bit unsure with Andrew. Shall we do that? Shall we not do that? And we said, why not? We put it there, and we're quite prepared to actually withdraw it if there was some resistance. But actually, it caught their imagination.
Well, it's produced quite a strong response.
Both.
Yeah.
And then we sort of played the game, okay, we're going to withdraw. I said, no. And now the center wants to produce it as their contribution to the university. And now the university is interested in these new ways of learning.
It seems to me absolutely terrific.
Well, it hasn't it hasn't.
Slowly.
It hasn't got through yet.
It hasn't gone through.
Okay, it's got to go through every conceivable committee. Okay, it hasn't got through one committee.
I wonder, we do something similar that's come out of the course, the MA at Goldsmiths, in that people get a chance quite early on in groups of about 3 at a time in an afternoon to talk about how come they're there doing that course. And it's part of the whole subject anyway for the personal to keep coming in.
Absolutely.
And to interact
Absolutely.
with the learning and the culture. That's what it's all about. That's why I wonder, it might be a bit of a red herring if other departments think they can just take this up.
I don't
and
think
it's gonna click.
No, they're just fascinated. But I think the difference is that ours is going to be assessed.
Yes.
I don't know about, if I can say, we should be quite honest. We've said, look, we're not prepared to do this just because you think this is a nice idea that we can do if we want. This has to be assessed and be one of the 4 core courses. If you can't let us do that, then we drop it. Because I'm not going to do any more just because of the love of it. It has to be absolutely part of the thing. The jargon we came up with, I think, is understandable even if you don't like jargon. A learning journal is located at the interface between conceptual study and self-reflexive processes. And that is because you can't get people on a master's course to have training, to have an analysis.
But doesn't it happen informally all the time anyway in this sort of learning?
Yeah, but we don't. You see, this is something maybe we could talk. Perhaps it would get bogged down in one particular point. I think strategically and symbolically that if we can get this an absolutely kosher part, assessed part of a master's course, then you're rolling to bringing in experiential stuff that therapists know is essential if you're going to study depth psychology. But if you just have it as a kind of nice thing...
And as you say, you're quite right, it happens informally. And that's the difficulty. If it happens informally, it's difficult to monitor it, and you don't elevate it to its level, and it's something else if it's an actual course.
You're right.
This is something that actually, it sounds to me reminiscent in a way of the trainings in art therapy, which I've been involved in for a long time. Because, first of all, they're always in an academic institution, and they always have to be accessible in terms of usually a diploma level first, and then a master's level. And the diploma level is very much experiential plus academic. And the master's level has had that component in it, so people do their own art groups as part of that, where they disclose a certain amount, but it's not for personal therapy. And those kind of very difficult boundaries are often hard to negotiate, but a part of the training. And the master's level, because people are already practicing therapists when they engage in the master's degree, they're in fact bringing experience, which sounds rather similar if you're going to be having practicing therapists already involved in a master's degree. So,
Catherine does something similar. Tell us.
Well, I'm not sure
Well, I mean, the group that you are running for family therapists.
Well, yes, I suppose it is. Well, actually, I was going to bring in family therapy because that's one of the. It's one of the trainings which does not require a personal therapy, and so they've had to develop something self-reflexive. And this group that I run actually is not assessed, but I think that it's compulsory. They have to come to it, but it is confidential, and it's the family therapy students on a diploma at the Maudsley who come and talk about their own personal history and their own learning experience, and most of them, not all, are foreign, and how they fit into the new culture of a new university. And it becomes very personal, and as you say, the interface between the therapy group and the sort of self-reflexive generalising sort of capacity of a group to hold it is very difficult to run. But it's interesting that it comes out of a systemic family therapy background where they don't have personal therapy and they've had to develop something else.
Yes, the other route is gender studies. Because if the personal is political, how can you discuss the things they discuss on gender study courses if people don't bring their personal experiences, usually as women, into it? That's always background.
I think I must say that it also harks back to the old social work courses that used to be and the interesting thing about them is that they were gradually edged out of academic institutions. I think Goldsmith was about the last. And Croydon, but they used to be all over the country.
With a strong experiential component.
Yes, but not demanding that people have personal therapy.
Yeah, but there is the difference, and you see, if we were running a clinical training, I think there'd be much less energy in this issue. But we're not. We're offering a high-level master's course with an element that we're all free associating to as part of clinical trainings in family therapy and social work, or my association was to personal analysis. So this is the radical well, art therapists are going to be therapists.
Well, the master's course is not. That's the difference. The distinction is between the training course and the master's course. So you have a problem. Sometimes we're not therapists, but generally who are. So I think there is a
but I'm sure the parallel exists. But the point, though, is in both these instances, the master's art therapy and our masters, is that this is not a clinical training. Yet you've got this component, and selling that to hard-nosed, sort of left of centre, terribly brainy academics is very, very interesting thing to do, because they don't. A lot of them don't simply don't see what on earth could possibly be the point.
Happens, it's going to have an enormous effect on these masters.
Well, that's what.
Well, everybody introduce a very different personal component.
Every psychoanalytic studies course sweats on this. The ones that have a psychotherapy qualification at the end get rounded. Or don't get rounded. It's not a problem because they have most of them make personal therapy a requirement. It's the academic courses that have totally failed to address this. Well,
but I mean, at Sheffield, they attempt an interface by mixing the students for certain seminars as a way round. But it's and a self-evaluation process each year, which is an assessed process. But that's minuscule compared with what you're suggesting. That's very interesting.
We're suggesting 25% of the 20% of the marks.
20%. And in the university regs.
Look, we're going to have to stop in a few minutes, and I mean, I'm very conscious, as Catherine was picking up, that at least you have got each other, and it's quite nice to see you together, working together, complementing each other, and you're not on your own up in Essex. But I mean, there's a great deal of support for what you're doing, and it does seem very important to consolidate this foothold you've got in Essex at the minute. And I'm just wondering whether there's anything you want to feed in at the end of it about what you need from the SAP and the other Jungian organisations.
Are you serious? It's past time. I'll tell you.
I'll say one thing.
I'll say yes.
Well, I'm very hard-nosed about these things. Technically, no, not money. Actually, that's not no. In 1 year from now, technically, our contract expires. It's renewable for 2.
Yeah.
And I hope will be renewed for 2, but you can't anticipate anything. So that's one anxiety. Technically, a year from now, we stop. I'm glad Mary Adams isn't here in a way, but I mean, what happens? What happens? And then 2 years after that, we definitely face something. So I'm not asking for anything particular except for people to start thinking now, because we can't be responsible for the long-term planning that has to happen at a high-level institutional, a high level in this institution and in the university. So that's that's my one request, is that people start to get hold of this. We've got 1 year technically, probably 3, I think it's fair to say. Then, I don't know. And that scares me actually at night. I think, God, we're taking on all these PhDs. Excuse me, I get quite emotional about it. We're starting a master's course. What on earth is going to happen? If at the end of it all,
some people live, they refashion their lives to do that.
Yeah.
Somebody's coming from the States, leaving everything to come here and do his.
When we're in love with a job, we say, well, we'll just do it for nothing anyway.
You'll be making so much money for the university.
No.
Well, anyway,
but
already the university is making a lot of money out of us. A lot. I mean, with 9 PhD students, it's a lot of money.
Yeah, but yes.
And distance learning.
No.
And distance learning.
I'm the pessimist in this odd couple thing.
All right, well, we are going to do.
He has this one thing.
My one thing. My one thing is a small thing. My one thing is not about. It's not a request. It's a concern. The concern is actually paradoxically what happens if we do too well, and already started happening in some respects. Once the master's course is running, 1 day a week, running the master's course, attending to those students, supervising all these PhDs, it's already with the 10 lectures we do. If somebody asks how much do you lecture, you say 10 lectures between us. It's nothing, but actually we're doing everything else.
Oh, but multiply it by 4 for a full-time equivalent. That's the point.
Sure. But
is that what you think should happen?
So my concern is what happens when the work goes well. For example, Andrew has equivalent things. I've been asked by the psychology department that had nothing to do with the psychoanalytic studies to connect with them and give them some lectures there. I cannot do it. The vice chancellor from here of sociology has asked me to do some research together with a lot of money. I would love to do that. I cannot do it within my 1 day a week there. So what happens if the enthusiasm, the good work is generating more stuff, and actually the context is such that cannot allow that progression? Will it start regressing? Will we have a kind of an entropic disintegration? I don't know. What I do hope is that with the support from everybody, more jobs will be created, more opportunities, more interaction with other colleagues in other institutions, so that we do not allow that to dry out on its own, even if it's doing extremely well.
Okay, we must stop there, but thank you very much, because what you're really saying is that there is a need for some long-term planning and long-term thought about this, and at least by bringing so much information as well as ideas this evening, you've given the 25 people in this room a chance to think about it.
Please take the material here.
Yes, there's just the right number, Andrew, with perfect intuition. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.